So, before we start to figure out how the categorical imperative will allow us to derive imperatives of duty, we need to make sure we understand both what a duty is and also the distinction between a perfect duty and an imperfect duty. So, absolute obligatory duties are perfect duties. And that's one class of duties. And meritorious or imperfect duties, that's another class. Oftentimes, people will just focus on perfect duties. Perfect duties are actions such that the maxim that prescribes the action could be a universal law that prescribes such a behavior for all people. And importantly, it could be willed that way. That is, all agents across all circumstances would will that in those circumstances. However, some maxims is such that the maxim prescribes that action couldn't be universalized. It couldn't be universalized in the sense that trying to have that as a necessary instinctual behavior would make it impossible for the action to be universally carried out. So it's self-contradictory. It undermines the ability to be generalized in and of itself. And if that's the case, right, then the maxim prevents the maxim from being universally followed. And those actions are not perfect duties. In fact, the negated maxim specifies a perfect duty. So let me give you an example of a self-contradictory idea. It's not in morality, but illustrates how this works. So when I was just getting out of high school and going to college, trying to figure out what classes I would take, and I was sweet on this girl, and she was sweet on existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. So I thought, well, here's what I'll do. I'll take a philosophy class, and there'll be lots of, coffee house, turtleneck wearing, clove cigarette smoking good times, right? Now, things never worked out the way I thought they might. And I knew things were starting to go off the rails. One night I was sitting there in the coffee house, me, her, and her best friend. And her best friend says, there are no true universal statements. And I'd been taking my philosophy class for a little while, so I reflected on that. And I said, no, you're wrong. You're wrong because if that statement you just made was true, it would be false. It's a universal statement. So if there are no true universal statements, then that statement would be false. But if a statement's false, it's true, so it's internally inconsistent. Girlfriend gave me the stink eye. Relationship started to go downhill from there. I discovered that I have no philosophical affinity for Jean-Paul Sartre. Life goes on. Okay? But that's an example of an inconsistent statement. Right? And this is the same kind of idea that Kant's employing with maxims that specify an action and the context in which the action would be performed. So when we ask ourselves, how can we recognize what we ought to do in a circumstance? What would be our duties? What's morally permissible and so on? Kant recommends that we go ahead and test our maxims for our actions and see if they pass these two different tests. Right? So remember, in order to be a morally praiseworthy action for Kant, it has to be an action that would be willed to be a universal law. So you have to, in all circumstances, want this to be a necessary universal behavior according to the maxim. So you have to ask yourself, okay, is this maxim the sort of maxim that could specify or be a rule for people's behavior in those circumstances always? Some actions make that impossible. Some actions just couldn't be generalized that way. Those actions then are going to fail that test of the universal maxim. Other actions are such that, well, they could be, the world would still function if everybody behaved in accordance with the maxim. But they're not the sort of action that could be willed to be universal. That the will of the action, saying, I want to do this, would prove inconsistent across different people or across different times for the same person. So it wouldn't always be the case that someone would will that action or that maxim be universally followed. So if the maxim passes the test of the universal maxim, that is, it's a consistent mode of action, but it fails the maxim of the universal will, then you have an imperfect duty not to take that action. Okay? If the maxim passes the test of the universal maxim and the test of the universal will, it would be consistent with the categorical imperative. You're going to act in a way that you would will was a universal law. Then it's a perfect duty. If it fails the test of the universal maxim, it's a sort of behavior that couldn't be generalized and made universal, then you have a perfect duty not to perform that action. So let's go through this and then talk about a couple of examples. Some are from Kant, some are others. Perfect duty, then, is one where the maxim is what Kant refers to as a synthetic a priori truth. So an a priori truth is just something you discover through rational reflection, independent of experience. And to be a synthetic truth is to be a statement where your negation, the negation of that statement, isn't self-contradictory. It's not necessarily false when you negate a statement. Okay? We can still figure out whether or not a maxim expresses one of these synthetic a priori truths. And we can do that by first testing it for universality. Right? Is it the sort of thing that could be universal and necessary, what he sometimes calls a universal instinct? If it were just programmed into people to behave that way in the circumstances, always, without exception, is that possible? That's one test. And then we test and see whether or not it would be consistent for people to will that as a general rule, a universal necessary instinct across those circumstances specified by the maxim. So if an action is a perfect duty, then the maxim has to be capable of being universal and necessary, and it has to be capable of being willed consistently to be universal and necessary. So we can test for perfect duties by seeing if the maxim contradicts itself. That is, it's something that can't be universal. If it can't be, then we have a perfect duty not to act in accordance with the maxim. If it can, then we test to see if it would be universally willed to be a universal maxim. And if it's not universally willed to be a universal maxim, then its negation, that is the maxim that says don't do that, that would be an imperfect duty. If it's universally possible and it's possible to universally will it, then it also is a perfect duty. So to test to see if an action is a perfect duty, you formulate the maxim describing the actions and the reasons and the context in which the action would be taken. You ask yourself if it would be possible for everyone, including yourself, to always take that action in the conditions specified by the maxim. And if the maxim fails too, that is, it's not something that is internally consistent. It's not something that could be a universal, necessary, instinctual behavior. Then the maxim that forbids that action is a perfect duty. The maxim is universalizable. Could be a universal instinct. Then you have to decide if you would always will that all people take such actions towards all people in all the situations the maxim covers. Now, if it's both universalizable and universally consistently willable, then it is perfect duty. If it fails, that second test. If it's consistent, but it's not consistently willed to be universal, then it's an imperfect duty. So here's an example from Kant about why he derives an imperative of perfect duty from the categorical imperative. So suppose you are going through a period of melancholy. You're like, Locke in his 20s, where he had his mental break, and you feel like killing yourself because you just don't think the world will ever get better. Your life's not going to get better. Well, Kant says, imagine you formulate that maxim. So when you're unhappy or distraught or you don't see your life ever getting better, then can you act out of your own love for yourself to end your life? And he says, okay, let's test that maxim for universe. Let's use the universal maxim test. Let's see if it's possible to be consistent as a universal and necessary instinct. And he says, nah, it can't be. Because look, if self-love motivates me both to maintain my life and to kill my life, then it's a motivation that that results in contradictory actions. And so as a result, it's not a consistent universal instinct. Self-love can't be the sort of thing that causes you to kill yourself, because self-love is also the sort of thing that wants you to preserve yourself. So he says, taking my life now would make it impossible for me to preserve my life later. So he says the maxim that asserts that I can't take that action is a perfect duty, so I always have a perfect duty to preserve my life, to not commit suicide.